Atkinson with the Progress Index. All right, we will move to Jessica Jewell.
I'm sorry, I'm right here. I'm sorry.
Okay, all right.
I apologize. I had some technical issues on my end. This question is for Governor Northam or Dr. Lane. Are there any anticipated time frames for the phases of the reopening of the schools like there were during the general reopening of Virginia? I mean, are you thinking like there'll be maybe 2 to 3 weeks or so many weeks in length, or will the phases be based on individual school systems? And then also, what about the state's poorer school systems who don't have the revenues that larger systems have? What kind of assistance can be provided to them to help them get through these phases?
The question is about the phases of reopening our schools, and the phases will be consistent with the phases that we've been talking about all along. We're, except for Northern Virginia and Richmond right now, who will enter phase 2 on Friday, we're in phase 2. We will look at the data, the number of new cases, the percent positivity, the hospital beds, our PPE, testing capability, all of those things as we move into phase 3. But a minimum of 2 weeks between phase 2 and phase 3. But looking at the data, again, we want to move forward safely and responsibly. So we'll, as soon as we can, we'll let you know when we are going into phase 3. The second part of the question was about resources, and we have received relief from the federal government through the CARES Act. We are looking presently of how we can distribute that into our localities, and certainly if there are school districts that need that help, we would be glad to have that discussion with them and take that into consideration.
Governor, just had a question for Dr. Lane, who mentioned the achievement gap. Just wondering if he had some new plan to close that gap. A lot of Virginia school systems have been battling the achievement gap for a number of years. And then on sidebar, as you have mentioned, you're going to call the legislators back. Just wondering what are your priorities upon calling them back, and when will you make that call, please?
Andre, I have to see 3 parts to your question, and I'm going to just touch on 2 of them. As the last part of your question was, when are we going to call the legislature back to Richmond, and what will our priorities be during that time? The date has not been set, but we look at doing a reforecast probably in the next few weeks into July. And just this is ballpark, but I anticipate calling the legislature back in early August for a number of reasons. The most important reason is our budget. And as you know, we had to hit the pause button coming out of session this year because of COVID-19. I think that we'll have a much better idea in the upcoming weeks of what our revenue is going to be coming into Virginia. So that will be certainly a top priority. But also, Andre, with what's going on with the protest and the police brutality that we've all been experiencing, there is ongoing discussion with legislators as to how we can turn our listening and learning into policy, how we can turn it into action. And so we're having those discussions, and I suspect that some of those issues, some of those pieces of legislation will be taken up in the special session, if that's what the General Assembly agrees to, and then also they'll be continued in our upcoming session in January. One of the things I wanted to just touch on before Dr. Lane comes up, and we've talked about the Robert E. Lee statue that is a monument of divisiveness that needs to come down. There are other monuments of inequities that we desperately need to address as we move forward, and one of those is access to education. And one of the things that, as you know, we just shot another video yesterday for it, but is my wife's and my commitment and our administration's commitment to early childhood education. that is really the tide that lifts all boats. And while we've had to hit the pause button on our budget, it is one of my top priorities as we move forward to make sure that all of our children, because we know that the majority of the development of the brain takes place in the first couple of years, and so we want all children, not just those that have the means, but all children to have access to early childhood education. And I really think of all the things that we can do to help everybody start out with equality in life, it's access to education. So we'll continue to make that a top priority. And Dr. Lane, I'll let you handle the rest of the question. Thank you.
Thank you, Governor. Thank you for the question. First, I'll agree with the Governor that there is an achievement gap on the first day of kindergarten. And if we're going to ever eliminate the achievement gap permanently, we're going to have to do more work in the space of early childhood, more access, higher quality programs, and we've been working on that for some time. In 2017, the Board of Education adopted a new accreditation system. And as part of that accreditation system, for the first time, they held schools accountable for eliminating achievement gaps as part of the system. We've been reporting achievement gaps for nearly 20 years, but we're only within the last 2 years at the point where we're actually holding our schools accountable, and as part of their school improvement plans, when they enter into state technical assistance, working with them on that. Not that that hasn't always been a part of the work, but now it's a requirement of the work. The board has announced that they are going to open the standards of accreditation again this year and begin to look at more ways that we can build equity into our system. We have a lot to do in the funding equity space. The board made recommendations and promulgated new standards of quality, which was a long-term look into where we want to go to make sure we're getting money to the schools that need them the most to make a difference for students. But ultimately, on top of those structures, we're going to have to do a better job of putting culturally responsive teaching practices into trainings for our teachers, into the standards and the way that we approach them, and building cultural competence for educators to make sure that every child sees themselves in every classroom. We have phenomenal educators in Virginia that are doing this work already, and we'll continue to build upon that. Thank you.
Before we take the next question, I misspoke about receiving or requesting your absentee ballot. So the deadline is not today at 5 o'clock, it's next Tuesday at 5 o'clock. So just wanted to make that clear to everybody. Next question.
Jessica Jewell with WSLS.
Good afternoon. Governor, some parents are very concerned about how they're going to be able to teach their kids from home and work again in the fall. Teachers are worried about how they're going to be expected to be in the classroom 5 days a week with their own kids at home. Are you worried about large numbers of teachers leaving their jobs so they can stay at home with their kids? And how can you address this? And then my second question is, how will these guidelines impact students on buses?
Do you want to address the bus issue? You actually address both questions if you want.
Thanks again, Governor. I'll answer the question about buses and then go back to the information on working parents, and then certainly Dr. Furlano can help on this as well. The guidance from the Virginia Department of Health does have 6-foot social distancing required on buses and classrooms. Now, that isn't to say that a school division couldn't put in place other mitigation strategies, but the guidance from the Virginia Department of Health is based on 6-foot social distancing because the research that we've looked at has supported that as the primary factor in reducing transmission. As it relates to working families, especially our teachers, we certainly consider this an important piece of the planning that all of our school divisions have to do. In earlier thoughts on this as we were working within our task forces, we thought about creating capacities and the such that would drive the thinking, but ultimately, in partnership with the Department of Health, we based the plan on 6-foot social distancing to provide the most flexibility that we could to our local school divisions while giving them an opportunity to plan for unique scenarios. So there may be school divisions that create plans where they can serve the children of teachers on a daily basis. It's certainly going to take partnerships. I met today with a ton of members of the nonprofit community and the child care community that can think about filling this gap. Child care is open, and so school divisions are going to have to think about unique ways to use space, but it might take, when you think about equity, it might take a strategy that requires students that have no access to child care and no way to afford it additional opportunities in the school, as long as the schools can maintain the 6-foot social distancing while creating a hybrid program for most of the students in the school. So we began about a week ago having conversations with our superintendents about how they would do this. Many of our superintendents are reaching out to community partners, like I said, childcare, the Y, nonprofits, to help support this. But at the end of the day, what we want to make sure is as we move our students into schools, we're doing it in a safe manner, but in a partnership that allows us to make sure that working families have options for childcare. So thank you, Governor.
I was wondering if you could provide additional details on how CARES Act funding might be distributed to schools, given that it can't replace lost revenues. And also, this year was obviously, historic, in Virginia, raising funding for schools back to pre-recession levels. So has there been any thought to whether the state will be able to maintain that funding increase as agreed upon in the session?
Yeah, Dr. Lane's going to come back up, but it's the first part of your question about the CARES Act, and again, that's discussion that we're having as we move forward, and we'll consider all of those requests as we move forward. If you wanted to answer the other part, thanks.
Thank you, Governor. I'm not sure I can answer the second question on the General Assembly funding, but I will answer the question on the CARES Act. The CARES Act was distributed. There was $238 million that came to Virginia. 90% of those funds went directly to localities, and the federal government mandated that we use the Title I formula. It is not Title I funding, so it doesn't have to be spent like Title I funding. It can be spent on their needs as it relates to relief from the coronavirus. But we use the Title I formula to send those funds directly to localities. The other 10% of funds are in what we call a state set-aside for state activities, and there will be a press release on that in the near future.
Yeah, hi. I just had a question about contact tracing. I was just wondering if the recent protests have affected that work, and if questions they're asking people who tested positive for COVID have changed.
The question is about contact tracing and the recent protests. And I think just to, sum that up, we obviously are concerned when we see individuals that are protesting and that are not maintaining their social distancing, not wearing facial protection. We obviously appreciate everybody's right to protest, but we want it to be done safely. And so we want everybody out there in Virginia to know that testing is available. We encourage protesters, if they feel that they've been in contact with other individuals, to go to our website to find out where the testing sites are in their communities, and really to move forward with that testing. As you know, on Friday, I was at one of the community testing centers in Chesapeake. It's a easy test to have done, and I would just encourage all of you that have questions about whether you have been in contact, whether you have the virus, if you're worried about it, if you have symptoms, et cetera, to really get out there and take advantage of these community testing sites and obtain the testing yourself.
Governor, we know you've been, going back to the statute, preparing the legality of that kind of a move for a year or more. But this particular injunction that was filed this week, did that catch you off guard? Were you at all concerned that the judge would rule without the state being present? And do you know of any other suits that have been filed like this?
Do you want to answer that? Thank you, Greg. I want to let a lawyer answer your question.
But do you have a personal response to it, though?
Well, my response is that we've been preparing for this for a year. This is a statute that is divisive. It needs to come down, and we are on very legal, solid grounds to have it taken down. But I will let our counsel address it in more detail if you'd like. Thank you.
Thank you, Governor. So as the governor said, we have the council's office has been preparing for this opportunity for over a year. We were well aware of the potential legal challenges. We are also well aware of the governor's authority to do this. The process that's begun in Richmond Circuit Court is going to be a multi-stage process. The first step was a temporary retaining order or restraining order entered yesterday. That is by no means the end of this issue. It is only the beginning. There will be several other stages of this process by which we will vigorously defend the governor's authority to do this. And at the end of the day, we fully expect that the Circuit Court and maybe even necessarily the Virginia Supreme Court will affirm that. Did I get all of your questions?
Have any other cases been filed so far?
Well, not that we are aware of, but as we have seen with the Richmond Circuit Court, unfortunately, we may not be aware of other injunctions that have been entered in other circuit courts. But as I stand here today, we are not aware of any other actions against the governor's decision to take down the monument. Thank you.
Roger Watson with the Farmville Herald.
Thank you, Governor. Is it your belief that Confederate markers and statues in other towns across the state should also be removed for the same arguments that you made when announcing the removal of the Lee statue in Richmond?
I believe if I heard his question, is it my belief that the other statues should be removed in different localities? And Roger, if I heard your question correctly, I am in charge as governor with our administration and council of the Lee statue, which is owned by the Commonwealth of Virginia. If there are other statues, street names, military bases, we introduced and passed legislation this year. It was passed, and it gives localities the option of dealing with their monuments, Confederate monuments, names of roads, etc. So it is my position that I will deal with what I have responsibility for, but I'm going to allow, and that's what the General Assembly agreed on, to allow the localities to make decisions about those that are in their regions.
So, Governor, last week the mayor of Richmond asked you for a curfew. You granted the curfew, and then yesterday the Richmond Commonwealth's attorney came out and said she's going to waive incarceration for anyone who violated the curfew. We've heard from a lot of folks who say, well, what's the point of a curfew then if there's no consequences? Since you granted it, what's your take on that?
Well, I was asked by the mayor to apply a curfew, which we agreed to. As far as the Commonwealth's attorney's position, that's something that they're going to need to speak to. I don't have authority over that. Thank you all so much, and again, I appreciate you all being with us today. I think there's some exciting things going on in Virginia with reopening of our schools, getting our kids back on the athletic fields, and we can only do this because we've been vigilant, we have followed the guidelines, and I ask you all to continue to do that so that we can continue to move through these phases and eventually get out of the phases, get this health crisis behind us, and move on and get back to as near normal lives as we can. So I ask that of all Virginians, and I appreciate your cooperation, and we look forward to being with you on Thursday. Thank you.